We lecture now on Blaise Pascal and the issue of skepticism and Jansenism. As we have seen in several lectures, skepticism is another of the systematic philosophical assaults upon the dominance of the Aristotelian scholastic system, still in control of the universities and institutions of the European intellectual world. There are very deep skeptical strains in the 17th century about the claims of human knowledge, and the dominant form of philosophical skepticism in the 17th century is what we term fideism, from fide, the root meaning faith. Fideism holds two central positions: that human knowledge cannot attain significant certainty, and that this weakness of human knowledge should convince us of our absolute dependence upon faith and upon God's grace. There were two most influential fideists of the 17th century. We have already discussed one, Pierre Bayle, French Huguenot Protestant, and now we shall discuss the second, in many ways the most deeply influential and unambiguously fideistic author of the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, a Catholic who becomes part of a movement within French Catholicism that we shall discuss, called Jansenism, from the doctrines of Bishop Jansen, who wrote a book on the subject of St. Augustine and Augustinian theology. But before turning to Jansen, let's understand why Pascal's movement to fideism is of such particular drama for the 17th century. And that is because Pascal had achieved, starting as a child prodigy, a brilliant career on the frontiers of the new quantitative sciences and mechanical sciences of the 17th century. This man who would become so symbolic of the denigration, the fatuity, the indifference of the reach of human reason, had enjoyed one of the most meteoric successes in the history of 17th century scientific accomplishment. He had been a child prodigy in mathematics, and in the course of his young years, he did foundational work on conic sections, on cycloid curves, on barometrics, the science of air pressure. Pascal's work was an absolutely core contribution to, on fluid dynamics, on pneumatics, and on the mathematical calculus of probability. To aid his father, who was a tax collector in Rouen, he even devised a binary digital calculating machine whose construction he oversaw, which many see as the first human computer, which is why one of the primary computing programming languages is named after him, obviously Pascal. But after his encounter with Jansenism, Pascal largely abandons his scientific career and will engage the centuries-old, age-old contest between piety and natural knowledge. Within Catholicism, Jansenism, which is strongest in France, but which also makes very deep inroads in the Low Countries and in Italy as well, Jansenism was a continuation of the contest between, in the simplest terms, Augustinianism, the religious doctrines of St. Augustine, on the one hand, and Thomism, the doctrines of St. Thomas Aquinas, on the other. Though both Jansenists and Thomists in the 17th century forever accused anyone who described the two positions as having misrepresented their own, it is safe to say that Jansenism looks upon the effects of the fall upon human beings through the darkest Augustinian lenses. The fall, the separation of human beings from God in this world, has left us with a will that, unless acted upon by God's grace, is incapable of wanting or choosing the good, and with a reason that is incapable of any significant knowledge, including a rational understanding of its own weakness and its own dependence upon faith. Jansenism also took the view that under the influence of, above all, the Jesuits, the Catholic Church in the 17th century had come to look upon the issue of God's grace as an issue, above all, of participation in the sacraments of the Church. That, from the Jansenist perspective, the Jesuits and the Thomists had ignored the indispensability of a personal encounter between the sinner and Christ's love and forgiveness, and had substituted sacramental dispensation. Was one baptized? Did one take communion? Had one gone through the sacrament of marriage? Had one received last rites? But for the Jansenists, these were acts that only had religious significance if one had been touched by the grace of God, if one had relied upon the forgiveness of Christ, if one had had one's night of despair and fire and turning toward God and participation in the sacrifice of Christ upon the cross through the election and grace of God. A leading Jansenist thinker and a major Cartesian philosopher as well, Antoine Arnauld, wrote a book called On Frequent Communion, in which he discussed what for him was the absolute scandal of frequent communion in the church of the 17th century. What was the church's operational view of grace and the sacrifice of Christ? Someone sinned all week, then went to confession, then was given a ritual and forgiveness, then took communion, participated in the sharing of the body and blood of Christ, and then on Monday began sinning again, and sinned all week, and went to confession, and received absolution, and took communion, and then began sinning again on Monday. For Arnaud, for the Jansenists, for Pascal, Christ had not died on the cross to provide 12 hours of feigned virtue for people, to provide a means of a cycle of redemption and a return to sin. Christ died on the cross that God could dispense his absolutely efficacious grace, his saving grace that would justify and sanctify, that would wash someone of sin, that would put someone in a state of grace with God. How dare these worldly, unchristian orders dominating the church, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, old Thomists, from the Jansenist perspective, proclaim to the world that Christ's death on the cross and the dispensation of grace was not saving, was not efficacious. The spectacle of frequent communion was intolerable, both as an arrogance and above all as a denial of the very meaning and mystery of Christ's death. Further from the Jansenist perspective, the church by the 17th century had become so worldly. What did the Jesuits want above all? To be confessor to aristocrats, confessor to kings, dukes, confessors to the wealthy and powerful who would bestow large gifts and foundations upon them, allowing them to commit their worldly sins week after week while telling them that they were participants in the church of God and in the grace of Jesus Christ. The institutional church, from the Jansenist perspective, had forgotten the reality of sin, the awesome consequences of the fall, the reality of grace and its meaning. Jansenism, at the urging of its enemies in France, would be condemned by the papacy. And the French church, believing itself to have a right to accept or reject papal judgments, that condemnation was accepted by the King of France and his church. From that moment on, Jansenism became the religious and political underground of France, a role it would play right up to the French Revolution itself over 130 years later. The leading center of Jansenism was a convent at Port Royal, where many thinkers such as Pascal would spend large parts of their year in writing, in reading, in prayer, and in meditation. Port Royal eventually would be razed to the ground by the monarchy of France. But it was there that Pascal became one of Europe's foremost apologists, that is, defenders of Jansenism, Catholicism, and Christianity. When Pascal died young in 1662, his friends at Port Royal found his papers, an unfinished work of Christian apologetics that was in part ordered, in part developed, but often just scattered thoughts and scattered observations that no one was certain how Pascal was going to arrange or how he was going to develop the argument. His friends, the Jansenists at Port Royal, arranged and edited his works, which were published as his pensées, his thoughts on religion, a work that electrified a generation and that has electrified European and indeed world readers ever since. What are the themes of Pascal's pensées and the nature of this work of apologetics if we arrange it as an argument? It begins with the misery of man without God. For Pascal, look at the human condition, and almost all of it is an attempt to avoid being alone with one's own self, one's own consciousness, one's own awareness of one's life. All human effort is an attempt at what Pascal calls diversion, our desperate efforts to avoid the deepest question, who am I? And what is my fate? Because that question always leads us to an awareness of our misery and our depravity. The things we say to people whom we think we love or whom we think are our friends, the bitter and hurtful things we do and say without being honest about our motives, the things we know we must do with our life that we are unable to do, the things we know we must not do that we do again and again. And we will attempt any diversion to avoid confronting that question, who am I? One looks at the misery of man without God, and one sees simultaneously the real nature and the absurdity of the human condition. For example, what could be more absurd but more real than war, than national divisions that come down to this? On this side of the river, my friend. On that side of the river, my enemy. On this side of the river, if I kill, it's murder. On that side of the river, if I kill, it is just and heroic. What could simultaneously be more real than that as a part of our actual lives? But what could be more absolutely absurd? In this valley, my friend, on the other side of the mountain, my mortal enemy. We understand that we are creatures of absurdity. What could be more real than power? And yet we must dress the king in ermine and in purple, and our judges in black robes and wigs, for without that we would find it absurd. that they exercise judgment, that they exercise authority. The king unclothed is unthinkable to us. What could be more real? But what could be more absurd than that human condition? We pride ourselves on our ability to understand in this century, but we cannot make any sense of ourselves. Mankind is a mass of contradictions. We are simultaneously creatures of genius and ignorance. Someone who can produce the most extraordinary work in mathematics cannot walk over an abyss on a width of plank that he could walk anywhere else because of the power of imagination. We have science without morality, capable of understanding the world, but incapable of using that knowledge in any manner consistent with a love of our fellow creatures. We have energy without purpose. That is virtually a definition of human life. Energy without purpose. We have reason capable of the most extraordinary science, and yet we are creatures of the most arbitrary custom. We are governed by custom, ruled by custom, yet capable of the highest scientific understanding. Why is one man a duke and another a commoner? It governs all of our lives. Absolute arbitrary custom. And yet, the same creatures who study the heavens in astronomy cannot rid themselves of the empire of custom. We are creatures of intellectual weakness. For example, we have reason without sincerity. What an extraordinary thing to see people passionately arguing at their most rational with no sincerity whatsoever. What contradictory creatures we are. We are always under the influence of our passions and our prejudices. There we are occupying one part of this cosmos, and yet we are unable to grasp intellectually either the infinitely large, which we cannot comprehend, or the infinitesimally small, which we cannot comprehend, yet we occupy a point between those two. Knowing our misery, knowing our weakness, what at least should we want to be true? What should we want to be true? Pascal is writing in an age in love with gambling. It's why there is so much work on probability in the 17th century. The 17th century gambles on everything. And Pascal says, you think you know what's important. Let's examine a certain wager and understand what in fact is the most important thing of all. You generation that loves to gamble, ponder this. Imagine a bet in which on one side there was no risk and the possibility of infinite gain. On the other, no possibility of gain, but a possibility of infinite loss. That would be the most interesting wager of which you possibly could be aware. That is the wager you face. That is the reality of religion. God either exists or God does not exist. If you bet, if you wager your life that God exists and you are right, you lose nothing. And there is the possibility of infinite gain. If you bet that God does not exist, if you're right, you gain nothing. If you're wrong, you lose everything. Bet that God exists. If you're right, gain everything, lose nothing. Bet that God does not exist. If you're right, gain nothing. If you lose everything. If there is one wager you should want to be able to make, it is on God. That is not a proof, Pascal insists. It is not a proof at all. But it is an incitement to want to know. And it is a demonstration of what really matters to you. But knowledge of God without knowledge of Christ is absolutely insufficient, because the world still makes no sense to us. Imagine that God created a world just as Descartes described. So what? There is still the misery of man, the contradictions and absurdity of life, incomprehensible to us. That the world had a creator, fine, but so what? What does it resolve? What does it answer for you? Without the knowledge of Christ, knowledge of God is a barren, empty, philosophical doctrine about a first cause, irrelevant and unimportant to human life. But faith and Christian revelation change everything. There are arguments, but they won't convince you, because one does not believe in Christ through the mind. One believes in Christ through the heart. There were miracles, there were prophecies fulfilled, but those won't tempt you at all, because the mind rejects what's good and the will rejects what's good. But if one is touched in one's heart by grace, the heart has its reasons which reason cannot comprehend. And the world finds it absurd, the Christian who believes by faith and by grace. But here is what happens. Have you ever looked at a trick picture, Pascal says? And you look at it, and you look at it, and it looks like one thing, and then you change your perspective on it. You look at it from another angle, and suddenly you realize it's a picture of something else. That is what Christian faith accomplishes, Pascal writes. When you understand the fall, you understand the absurdity and misery and dualism of human life. You understand why we are contradictions of the exalted and the base, the wise and the ignorant, the profound and the depraved. When you understand the sacrifice, the crucifixion, the blood, the grace of Christ, then that there is a God and that this is the world merited by the fall, and that there is a love that surpasses all understanding, makes sense of that world that formerly was incomprehensible. With faith, our contradictions and unhappiness, our greatness and depravity, and this world and God's goodness all fall into place. Not physics, not barometrics, not philosophy. None of these things is the goal of life. Inner peace and salvation are the goals of life. And those are matters of grace, the heart, and Christian faith. Thank you very much.